They were the richest people on Earth. Not the richest Native Americans, not the richest people in Oklahoma, the richest people per capita on the entire planet, and somebody was killing them for it. This is the story of the Osage Nation. People who had already survived everything the United States government could throw at them, forced removal, broken treaties, starvation, displacement, and who had, against every odds stacked against them, stumbled into one of the most extraordinary reversals of fortune in American history. Beneath the rolling hills of their reservation in northeastern Oklahoma lay one of the largest oil deposits ever discovered in the continental United States. Overnight, the Osage went from poverty to unimaginable wealth. They wore diamonds, they hired white servants, they bought Piercero automobiles and had chauffeurs drive them through the dusty streets of Pawhuska. They built mansions, they sent their children to the finest schools in the country, and the world looked at them with a mixture of awe and barely concealed fury. Because the world could not stand it. White America, which had spent over a century systematically destroying native communities, which had marched the Osage from their ancestral lands in Missouri, which had pushed them from Kansas, which had finally dumped them in what was supposed to be the most worthless land in Indian Territory, that same America now watched as the Osage cashed checks that would make a Wall Street banker weep. And something dark stirred beneath the surface of that watching, something that would eventually take the shape of murder. By the early 1920s, members of the Osage Nation had begun dying. Not from illness, not from accident, from bullets, from poison slipped into whiskey, from houses that exploded in the night. The killings were not random acts of frontier violence. They were methodical, deliberate, connected. One by one, the wealthiest Osage were dying, and one by one, their oil rights, their head rights, as they were called, were passing into the hands of white men, husbands, business partners, lawyers. Guardians appointed by a federal government that had decided the Osage were too primitive to manage their own money. It was a conspiracy so vast, so deeply woven into the fabric of an entire community, that for years nobody could see it clearly. Or perhaps the more accurate thing to say is that some people saw it very clearly and chose to look away. This is the story of what really happened in Osage County, Oklahoma in the 1920s. A story of greed so monstrous it turned neighbors into killers and silence into complicity. A story of a government investigation so early and so imperfect that it would, almost accidentally, forge the institution we now call the FBI. A story that was buried for decades, buried the same way the Osage buried their dead, and only recently pulled back into the light where it belongs. You need to understand what the Osage had already been through before the oil, before the murder, before any of this, because what happened to them in the 1920s did not arrive out of nowhere. It arrived out of a very specific, very deliberate history of dispossession that stretched back over a century. The Osage were originally from the Ohio River Valley. By the 18th century, they had moved into what is now Missouri and Arkansas, establishing themselves as one of the most powerful nations on the Great Plains. They were tall. Many Osage men stood well over 6 feet, physically imposing, militarily formidable, and diplomatically sophisticated. They traded with the French. They negotiated with the Spanish. When American settlers began pushing westward, the Osage adapted. They were not naive about what American expansion meant. They had seen what it did to other nations. But adaptation and sophistication were not enough. In 1808, the Osage signed their first major treaty with the United States government, ceding vast territories in Missouri and Arkansas in exchange for promises of peace, protection, and annuities. The promises were broken almost immediately, as they always were. More treaties followed in 1818 and 1825, each one taking more land, offering less in return. By the 1860s, the Osage had been pushed into Kansas. And then Kansas settlers decided they didn't want the Osage there either. There were violent confrontations. There was political pressure. There were petitions. White Kansans made clear with bullets and bureaucratic pressure both that the Osage needed to go. So in 1870, the Osage did something that seemed at the time like a remarkable act of pragmatic self-determination. Rather than accept yet another federal assignment to some patch of barren land, they pooled their resources, money they had accumulated from previous land sales, and bought their own reservation. 800,000 acres in the northeastern corner of Indian Territory, the land that would become Oklahoma. They paid for it themselves. They thought that ownership, real legal ownership purchased with their own money, might provide some measure of security that treaties never had. The land looked to white eyes like nothing much. Rocky, hilly, not particularly good for farming. The kind of terrain that a frontier speculator might glance at and pass by in search of more promising territory. The Osage had no way of knowing, nobody had any way of knowing, what lay underneath it. Petroleum. The first commercial oil well in Osage territory was drilled in 1897. By the early 1900s, it was becoming clear that the Osage were sitting on something extraordinary. Oil companies began swarming. The federal government stepped in, as the federal government always did with anything involving native land and money, and established a system by which the Osage would receive royalties from oil leases, royalties paid out in the form of what were called headrights. Every enrolled member of the Osage Nation had a headright, a legal right to an equal share of the mineral royalties generated from the tribal lands. These headrights could be inherited by family members, but they could not, this was crucial, they could not be sold or transferred to non-Osage. What this meant in practice was that during the oil boom years of the early 1920s, every enrolled Osage was receiving quarterly payments that ranged from the merely comfortable to the staggering. In 1923 alone, the Osage received more than $30 million in oil royalties, the equivalent of well over $400 million today, divided among roughly 2,000 enrolled members. Do that math and let it settle over you for a moment. These were real people receiving real checks for real money. Women who had grown up in poverty, who had watched their parents struggle to survive on broken government promises, were now hearing maids and cooks and drivers. Men who had been dismissed and condescended to by white Oklahomans for their entire lives were now buying automobiles when most white farmers in the region couldn't afford one. The Osage dressed beautifully. They threw parties. They traveled. Molly Burkhart, one of the central figures in this story, wore fine clothes and lived in a well-appointed house, and by any external measure was one of the most comfortable, secure people in Osage County. And she was watching her family die. Molly Burkhart was a full-blood Osage woman, deeply connected to the traditional practices of her people while also navigating the modern world with intelligence and grace. She was married to a white man named Ernest Burkhart, the nephew of a prominent local rancher named William King Hale. Hale was one of those men who seemed on the surface to be everything a frontier community admired: big, gregarious, generous, deeply embedded in local civic life. He called himself the King of the Osage Hills, and he meant it affectionately, but there was something in the title that revealed more than he intended. William King Hale loved the Osage, he said so constantly. He attended Osage funerals. He spoke a little of their language. He positioned himself as their friend, their protector, their advocate. And while he was doing all of this, he was, according to what investigators would eventually discover, masterminding a campaign to murder them for their money. The killings in what has come to be called the Osage Reign of Terror did not begin with a bang. They began the way the most insidious crimes always begin, quietly, one at a time in ways that could be explained away, attributed to accident, to illness, to bad luck. A woman named Minnie Smith died in 1918, apparently of a mysterious illness. Her husband, a white man named W.W. Vaughn, no, wait, let me be precise about this, her headright passed to her sister Anna. Then Anna Brown, Molly Burkhart's own sister, disappeared in 1921. Her body was found in a ravine, a bullet in her head. The cause of death was ruled by local authorities, who had every reason to look the other way, as death by alcohol poisoning, as if a bullet in the skull were a symptom of drinking too much whiskey. Then Molly's mother, Lizzie, died. Then her other sister, Rita Smith, was killed when her house was blown apart by a bomb in the middle of the night. A bomb that also killed her husband and a white servant woman who had the misfortune to be sleeping nearby. These were not isolated incidents. These were executions. And they were happening in a county where the local law enforcement, the county attorneys, the judges, and a significant portion of the white business community were so entangled with the perpetrators, financially, socially, politically, that any genuine investigation was essentially impossible. Local private investigators were hired. They turned up dead or suddenly discovered they had no interest in continuing their work. Witnesses went silent. Evidence disappeared. The Osage hired their own lawyer and sent petitions to Washington. The federal government sent investigators from the Department of Interior, who produced reports so thoroughly compromised by bribery and intimidation that they were essentially worthless. The killings continued. By 1923, the situation had become undeniable even to a government that had every historical incentive to ignore violence against Native Americans. The Bureau of Investigation, it would not yet become the Federal Bureau of Investigation until 1935, was a relatively young and deeply troubled agency. It had been founded in 1908, under circumstances that were themselves legally questionable, and in its early years it had been rocked by scandal, corruption, and political manipulation. In 1924, a young lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover was appointed as its new director, and Hoover arrived with a specific vision. He wanted to transform this ragged, patronage-ridden, semi-functional agency into something modern, scientific, professional, incorruptible. The Osage Murders presented Hoover with, among other things, an opportunity. He assigned the case to a former Texas Ranger named Tom White. And it is here that the story takes on the quality of something almost mythological: two traditions of American law enforcement, the romantic frontier lawman and the emerging federal investigator, colliding in a landscape that was itself at a crossroads between the Old West and the modern nation. Tom White was not a flashy man. He was tall, quiet, methodical, with the kind of patience that comes from years of working in places where you are badly outnumbered and one mistake gets you killed. He understood immediately that a conventional investigation was impossible in Osage County. Too many people were compromised, too many witnesses were terrified. The conspiracy, whatever its exact shape, had wrapped itself so completely around the local community that trying to investigate openly would be like trying to catch fish by announcing loudly that you are about to go fishing. So White did something that was, for American law enforcement at the time, almost unprecedented. He sent undercover agents into Osage County. One went in as a cattleman, one posed as an insurance agent. One, a Native American agent named John Wren, used his actual identity to build relationships within the Osage community. They moved slowly, they built trust, they listened. They gathered information in fragments, piecing together a picture that was emerging from the darkness, one terrible detail at a time. What they found ultimately was William King Hale. The full shape of what Hale had constructed was almost Baroque in its complexity and almost primitive in its motive. He had identified the Osage headright system as a mechanism for theft. If an Osage woman died, her headright passed to her closest relatives. If those relatives were or became related to white men, the money could eventually be controlled by those white men, even if the legal structure of headrights prevented direct inheritance. Hale's nephew Ernest had married Molly. That was part of the plan. Molly's sisters had headrights. If they died, those headrights would pass to Molly, and if Molly died or was quietly, slowly poisoned over time, everything would eventually flow to Ernest and through Ernest to Hale. It was a murder scheme designed like a financial instrument, patient, layered, hidden inside the ordinary transactions of everyday life, and it had killed, by the time investigators began to unravel it, dozens of people. The precise number will probably never be known. The official count has always been artificially low, constrained by the limits of what investigators could prove in a legal system that was, in the 1920s, not particularly interested in justice for Native Americans. Some researchers, including the journalist David Grann, who did the most thorough modern reconstruction of these events in his 2017 book, believe the true death toll may have been well over 100. Let that number sit with you. Over 100 Osage killed systematically over the course of years in a campaign so methodical and so embedded in the daily life of the community that it took federal investigators years to see its full outline. Tom White's investigation eventually produced enough evidence to bring charges. Hale was arrested. His nephew Ernest, faced with the evidence against him and perhaps also with some measure of the guilt that comes from having spent years watching your wife's family be systematically murdered, eventually cooperated with prosecutors. Hale was convicted of the murder of Henry Roan, an Osage man who had been shot in his car in a ravine in 1929. He received a life sentence. Ernest Burkhart was also convicted and received a life sentence, though he would later be paroled in a development that makes a dark story even darker. Hale served time and was paroled in 1947. He lived out his remaining years in Arizona, dying in 1962. The king of the Osage Hills, who had murdered and orchestrated the murder of people he claimed to love, people who had trusted him, people who had sat across tables from him and laughed with him and invited him to their funerals. He died at 81 years old in his bed, in a warm house, an old man with a past that most people in his new community probably knew nothing about. The investigation was, by any modern standard, deeply incomplete. Most of those responsible for most of the deaths were never charged. The local officials who had enabled the killings through corruption and inaction faced no consequences. The doctors who had provided false death certificates, the lawyers who had enriched themselves through fraudulent guardianships, the men who had pulled triggers for hire and walked away, most of them lived out comfortable lives in Osage County, surrounded by the neighbors who knew and said nothing, or who did not know and did not particularly want to. But here is what the investigation did produce, beyond the conviction of Hale and a handful of his associates. It demonstrated that the Bureau of Investigation could conduct a sophisticated, long-term undercover investigation in a hostile environment. It demonstrated that a federal agency could go where local law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't go, could follow evidence across jurisdictions, could build cases on patience and intelligence rather than confessions beaten out of suspects in county jail cells. Hoover used the Osage case, and several others from this period, as building blocks in his campaign to professionalize and expand the Bureau. The techniques developed in Osage County, undercover operations, systematic evidence gathering, the use of scientific forensics, became foundational to what the FBI would become. There is something deeply uncomfortable about that fact. The suffering of the Osage, their murders, their grief, their decades of unanswered demands for justice, these things were converted almost immediately into institutional capital for an agency that would spend the next several decades doing enormous harm to other minority communities, surveilling civil rights leaders, targeting activists, wielding its power with the same comfortable disregard for human dignity that had characterized the local law enforcement it was supposed to improve upon. The FBI was forged, in part, in the fire of the Osage murders. And it did not, as an institution, carry forward from that forging any particular commitment to the Osage people or to the broader injustice that had made those murders possible. The Osage themselves were largely left to hold their grief without resolution. Molly Burkhart, and this is the part of this story that breaks the heart completely when you sit with it long enough, Molly Burkhart had been slowly poisoned. While her sisters were being shot and blown up and her world was disintegrating around her, her husband had been administering poison to her. Almost certainly on the instructions of his uncle, methodically degrading her health, keeping her weak and increasingly dependent on the very man who was trying to kill her. She survived because the investigation moved faster than Hale and Ernest had planned. When the truth came out, when she understood what her husband had done, when she understood the full architecture of betrayal that had surrounded her life, she eventually divorced Ernest Burkhart. She survived. She lived until 1937. She buried her mother, her sisters, the other members of her community who had been taken. She lived with the knowledge that the man who had shared her bed had been slowly feeding her poison while their children played in the next room. What do you do with a grief like that? What do you do with a knowledge like that? Now step back even further from the individual tragedy and look at the structure beneath it, because the Osage murders did not happen in a vacuum. They happened inside a specific set of legal and social arrangements that the United States government had constructed, and those arrangements were not incidental to the killings. They were the mechanism of the killings. The guardianship system is the piece of this story that receives less attention than the dramatic murders, but is in many ways more revealing of how the whole thing worked. When Congress passed laws allowing the federal government to determine that Osage people, deemed insufficiently competent to manage their own financial affairs, could be assigned white guardians who would control their money, it created a structure of legal theft so perfect that murder was almost a redundancy. White lawyers, merchants, and businessmen were appointed as guardians over Osage individuals and families. These guardians charged fees from the headright accounts for their services. They steered Osage money toward businesses they owned or had interests in. They bought themselves the freedom to charge whatever they wanted for whatever they wanted and simply deduct it from accounts that their Osage wards could not directly access. There are documented cases of Osage people being charged for basic goods at 10 or 20 times the market rate. Cases of Osage men and women who received large headright payments on paper but lived in poverty in practice because their guardians had drained the accounts through fees and fraudulent transactions. Cases of guardians who, through the slow accumulation of legal control over an Osage family's finances, effectively owned those family members the way a paternalistic institution owns its charges, not through explicit slavery, which was illegal, but through a comprehensive legal architecture of control that produced the same functional result. This was the world that William King Hale operated in. He did not invent it, he refined it into murder. But the underlying structure, the assumption that the Osage could not manage their own affairs, that white men needed to be appointed over them, that their money was fundamentally available for exploitation by those with the right legal relationships, that structure was not Hale's creation. It was the United States government's creation, built on the same logic that had justified every prior act of dispossession, every broken treaty, every forced removal. When investigators from Washington came to Osage County in the early 1920s and began trying to understand what was happening, they were operating inside a system that was itself corrupt. The Department of Interior, which oversaw Indian affairs, had spent decades administering this guardianship system. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was riddled with employees who had personal financial relationships with the very guardians who were robbing the Osage. The political pressure not to look too closely, not to destabilize a system that was enriching so many people, was enormous. It took years and a new administration and the specific ambitions of J. Edgar Hoover to produce an investigation that was even partially serious. And even that investigation, even Tom White's careful and genuinely dedicated work, even the convictions that resulted, none of it addressed the structural problem. The guardianship system was not dismantled. The legal framework that had enabled the theft was not reformed. The people who had grown wealthy through exploitation rather than murder were not touched. The investigation solved a crime. It did not address the conditions that made the crime possible. David Grann, whose 2017 book brought this story to the widest audience it had ever received, spent years tracking down descendants of both the victims and the perpetrators. He interviewed elderly Osage women who were grandchildren of those murdered. He found documents in archives that had not been seriously examined in decades. He discovered names that had not appeared in prior accounts, deaths that had not been investigated, victims who had been so thoroughly forgotten that even their own tribal records contained gaps. And he found something that perhaps should not have been surprising but was nonetheless affecting. Many of the white families who had benefited from the guardianship system, from the fraudulent fees, from the quiet theft that surrounded the more dramatic murders, many of those families were still there, still in Osage County, still prosperous, living in houses and on land that their great-grandparents had acquired through the exploitation of people whose descendants were still their neighbors. History is not something that happened. History is the architecture you are still living in. The Osage Reign of Terror was not an aberration. It was an expression, particularly vivid and particularly documented, of a pattern of violence and exploitation that characterized the United States government's relationship with Native peoples across a century and more. The same legal structures, the same social permissions, the same fundamental assumption that Native wealth was fundamentally available for appropriation by white Americans, these things played out across the continent in 100 different forms. The Osage case is remarkable not because it was unique, but because it was extreme enough to produce an investigation that was serious enough to produce a record serious enough to survive. Most of it didn't survive. Most of it was never recorded at all. Most of the dispossession happened in the normal operations of systems that nobody particularly felt the need to document because they were not crimes, they were policy. Think about what was lost. Not just the lives, though the lives are incalculable. Think about the culture, the knowledge, the relationships, the simple, ordinary accumulation of human experience that was interrupted by murder and grief and the constant presence of death. Think about the children who grew up in households where adults were being poisoned, where houses were being blown up, where every death was officially explained away by authorities who had reasons not to look too closely. Think about the psychological weight of living in a community where you knew people were being killed and you could not trust the law to protect you and you did not know who around you might be part of it. The Osage had already built an extraordinary thing. Despite everything that had been done to them, despite the removals and the broken treaties and the poverty and the constant pressure of American expansion, they had used the oil wealth to create something remarkable. A community with resources, with institutions, with the capacity to send their children to schools and build their own futures. And then someone tried to take it from them the only way that remained, which was one murder at a time. They did not take it. The Osage survived. The nation survived. Today the Osage Nation is still there in northeastern Oklahoma, still governing their territory, still maintaining the cultural practices that survived a century of attempts to eradicate them, still negotiating the complex relationship between their sovereignty and the state and federal governments that surround them. The headright system still exists, though in modified form. The oil wealth has diminished as reserves have depleted over the decades, but the nation remains. In 2023, the story came back into public consciousness in a new form when Martin Scorsese released his film adaptation of Grann's book, with Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart, Robert De Niro as William King Hale, and the Osage actress Lily Gladstone in a performance as Molly Burkhart that was recognized as one of the finest of the year. The film made a deliberate choice to center the story on Ernest and Molly rather than on the investigation, to stay in the domestic space of the betrayal rather than the procedural space of its unraveling. It was a choice that some found frustrating and others found devastating in exactly the right way. Because the FBI investigation is, in a sense, the more comfortable story. It has a hero, it has a methodology, it has a resolution, however incomplete. The story of a woman watching her family die while the man she loves feeds her poison, that story has no comfortable structure. It just has the weight of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and the even more staggering weight of what human beings are capable of surviving. Lily Gladstone, who is herself a Native American actress of Blackfeet and Nez Perce heritage, won the Golden Globe for her performance and became the first Native American actress nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. The attention that came with that recognition brought renewed interest in the actual history, and Osage Nation leaders were vocal in their appreciation for the film's willingness to take the story seriously while also being clear that no film could fully contain what had actually happened. No film could name all the names, no film could account for all the deaths. No film could adequately represent the experience of a community that had been systematically targeted and had survived and was still there, watching as the larger culture discovered their history as if it were something new. The Osage had not forgotten. They had never forgotten. They had been telling this story for 100 years to each other in their own community, preserving it in the way that communities preserve things that official history does not record, through family memory, through ceremony, through the specific weight of certain silences. And here is the question that hangs over all of this, that hangs over this entire story and every story like it. What do you do with the knowledge? Not Molly's knowledge, devastating as it was, the larger knowledge, the historical knowledge. The knowledge that the wealth and comfort of certain communities was built, in part, on the deliberate murder of other communities, and that this was not an accident or an aberration but an expression of official policy carried out by official and unofficial agents of the American state across generations. There is no clean answer to that question. There is no gesture or apology or reparation that reaches back through a century and makes the dead less dead or the stolen less stolen. There is only the decision about what to do with the knowledge once you have it, whether to carry it honestly or put it down because it is heavy, whether to let the names be names or let them blur back into abstraction. Anna Brown, Lizzie Kyle, Rita Smith, Henry Roan, Charles Whitehorn, William's stepson, Joe Bates, Minnie Smith. These are some of the names, not all of them, not nearly all of them. The oil murders that created the FBI. That is the frame the story often gets put in as a founding myth of American federal law enforcement, as a procedural triumph, as an origin story for the institution that would define American policing for the next century. And there is truth in that frame. The Osage investigation was consequential for the Bureau. Tom White's work was genuine, and the techniques developed mattered, and the convictions achieved were real. But here is the thing about frames: they show you what is inside them, and they hide everything outside their edges. Inside the frame of the FBI origin story, the Osage are a backdrop. The real subject is the investigation, the agency, the triumph of federal law enforcement over frontier corruption. Inside that frame, the story has a satisfying arc: problem, investigation, resolution. Inside that frame, J. Edgar Hoover is a modernizer and Tom White is a hero, and the American system, for all its flaws, ultimately produces justice. Outside that frame is the Osage Nation, before the oil and after, the full sweep of what was done to them across more than a century. Outside that frame are the 100 or more names that investigators never assembled into charges, the deaths that were never officially counted, the grief that had no legal resolution. Outside that frame is the guardianship system that continued to operate, enriching white administrators at Osage expense for years after the Hale conviction. Outside that frame is Molly Burkhart, divorced, bereaved, her health permanently damaged by the poison her husband administered, living out the rest of her shortened life in the wreckage of what had been done to her family. Outside that frame, the story does not end with a conviction. It just continues, because the conditions that made it possible continued, because the legal structures continued, because the fundamental assumption that Native wealth was available for appropriation, that Native lives were less valuable, that Native grief did not require the same institutional response as white grief, that assumption continued. And it is only honestly, by looking both inside and outside the frame at the same time, that you can actually see what happened in Osage County, Oklahoma in the 1920s. Not just a crime, not just an investigation, a revelation of something that was already there, something that had been there for a long time, something that is, if you look with clear eyes at the system still operating around you, not entirely finished even now. The Osage were the richest people on earth. And somebody tried to kill them all for it. Some of those somebodies were caught. Most were not. The Osage are still here. Hold that, all of it at once. The wealth, the murder, the investigation, the conviction, the incompleteness, the survival. Hold it the way the Osage have always held it, as history that is not past, as knowledge that demands something of you, as a story that is not finished because its consequences are not finished, because the people it happened to are not abstractions but ancestors of living people who drive on the same roads and walk past the same buildings, and carry the specific weight of knowing exactly what happened there, exactly what it cost, and exactly how much of it the larger world preferred not to know. Now you know. What you do with that is up to you.